Hello, this is Mike Swanson, and you're listening to the Wall Street 1.0 podcast. Today is July the 3rd. The United States stock market is closed today ahead of tomorrow's July the 4th holiday. A strange year we're in. It's not going to be a normal July the 4th. And part of what is happening is culture wars are happening. Everywhere you look on the internet, if you're on there for more than 5 minutes on social media, you'll see a cultural warrior pop up. And historical controversies are abounding. And today I'm going to speak with Carmine Savastano. Carmine has written the book Human Time Bomb and also Two Princes and a King. And we had a discussion about an article that he just wrote for his website about slavery and how some people are making strange historical arguments about when slavery started, and Carmine goes and shows the true origins and importance of slavery. So one quick commercial break, and then we'll be talking with Carmine Savastano.
Carmine Savastano, Human Time Bomb, The Violence Within Our Nature, poses significant questions and considers the evidence that violence shapes the past and present. Author and Professor David T. Beato calls it an impressive tour de force. Savastano shows a mastery of relevant work in biology, anthropology, and intelligence. Each chapter will challenge readers to rethink old assumptions. Doctor of Psychology R. Blackstock notes, "It is a long, hard look into the potency of our collective shadow that is extremely relevant in today's socio-political climate." Historian and author Larry Hancock declares, "This work is a slap on the back of the head, a wake-up call, and a serious reality check as to the true human condition." Order your digital and print copies now on Amazon.com. For more information, visit tpaak.com.
How you doing today, Carmine?
I'm doing okay. How are you, Mike?
Oh, just fine. It's been a little while, a couple weeks since we last spoke, and you have put an interesting article up on your website, tpaak.com. That stands for Two Princes and a King, the title of one of your books. That deals with the JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King assassination. But you cover many topics, and I'm going to link to this article with the video and the podcast feeds and everything so they can read it themselves. But the title of it that you've written is A Brief History of North American Slavery. What inspired you to write about this?
Well, I think that there's a lot of conversation, obviously, from a lot of the events that are going on right now. And the conversation, I don't necessarily think has a very large perspective of the topic, of slavery, of oppression. You hear oppression mentioned a lot. And there's legitimate mentions, and then I think that there are illegitimate mentions. And I think that people tend to look at the things which affect them personally most. And they don't necessarily look at the larger picture or how we, from our modern perspective, look back and assume things that are true in modern times that were not true for most of human history. And so our judgment of it, while it can appear to be a stark, easy decision, if you look back at most of history, it's not the same thing. It's a much different calculation when you look at everyone responsible. And I think the reason why I focus on North American history is because there's a series of articles put out by the New York Times called the 1619 Project. And one of them actually won a Pulitzer Prize, which I think is a travesty, but that's a story for another day. The reason why I think it's a travesty and the reason why I wrote this article is because there are other historians that came out long before I did, but I'm attempting to add my voice to theirs to support them because the 1619 Project purports that slavery began roughly in North America in a colonialized and established way in 1619 under the English, and that was a basically poisoning event, according to those who were behind the 1619 Project, that pushed slavery into American society and thus made it permanently corrupt and systemically racist, and that capitalism is somehow connected to this as well, and that too has all of these bad connotations that they attempt to pile onto it because of their claim that it began in 1619. The foundational claim is that 1619, for some reason, that year is special more than any other year in their consideration.
Well, what happened? I haven't read the article, the New York Times article. So let me just ask you, what is it that happened that year that makes them want to draw so much attention to it?
Well, I believe that was when the English had codified and basically began their part in the massive rise of the slave complex. That's when the first English hands began to take over some of what had only prior existed in the hands of other imperial powers. And from the 1619 Project's perspective, they use that as some sort of origin point and ignore the centuries before it of slavery. And that, to me, is the biggest problem with it, is that they ignore the majority of the history of slavery to just pick this date that suits their narrative, and then act as if nothing had happened before then, and everything that had happened was on the shoulders of the English and thus the shoulders of the Americans, which is not historically accurate. It ignores much evidence to make that assertion.
Well, my understanding is that slavery, it probably begins with civilization itself.
Yes.
I mean, as far as I know, the first account of slavery is in the book of Genesis, speaking of Joseph as being the biggest slaveholder of the time, and also I think in the same section it also says he was the biggest trader or user of silver as money at the time. So that part of Genesis, I think, is one of the first recordings of money in slavery, connecting, I guess, the both of them. But I don't know if there's another account before that. I don't know, but I mean that's pretty ancient. If there's something else, it'd be like Gilgamesh or something. Something I don't know much about. I mean, the book of Genesis really goes way, 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 way back. So, and obviously Rome, Greece, where there's civilizations had slavery at the core of them.
Yeah, and I know for sure that two ancient world texts that also would support what the book of Genesis would be Hammurabi's Law or Hammurabi's Code, that established one of its codes was in regard to slavery. So it mentions it if it doesn't establish it like the Bible would. But I know that there's also ancient Israeli texts too that established that the practice was noted in people and practiced by some religious people. And if you look in the Quran, same thing. It's handed down. Perhaps one of the biggest things that the 1619 Project and those that only focus on the 99 years of antebellum slavery in America do not understand is that every person on earth, the best people we've ever known, Jesus, Muhammad, Socrates, Alexander the Great, every heroic person that ever existed roughly before the 1600s was for slavery. All of them. No one ever spoke out publicly in a major way until after the 1600s. Popes, imams, all of them were for slavery, a form of it. There were arguments about what type, but they all practiced it. Every major civilization, starting with Sumer. We can go back, roughly 6,000 years, and people were telling stories that a god had told them that it was okay to oppress other people. And that's been handed down in a wave of oppression throughout the ages. So to me, it is ridiculous, first of all, to use bad history to try to make your point, and secondly, to ignore the majority of the time it was practiced. That it's like a house. You can't build a house without a foundation. You have to talk about how the foundation was built to build the house.
Well, I guess let's say, when people use history to make arguments, often you'll see someone pick a date as the start of something. Mm-hmm. For instance, World War II. When did World War II start? Did it start in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, or did it start several years before that when Mussolini invaded Libya, or Japan invaded Manchuria, or whatever? Most people say it started when Hitler invaded Poland, but but a lot of the choice of dates is arbitrary. Yeah. Hitler did invade Poland in 1939, but one could argue about or some other date more important than that one. Yeah. So yeah. That's I'm just saying that picking the 1619 date, and just by doing that could have problems and just the act of doing it.
Oh yeah. No, and I'm not saying that. I'm sure there is some, maybe even a majority of good work in there, but unfortunately, the narrative in which it was encapsulated doesn't make sense, and in fact, it defies history. So and when people originally criticized it, they were called all manner of epitaph by those who supported it. But in the end, it turned out that they had to make a 500-word retraction and change what they wrote because it was wrong, because it was sloppy. It was bad history. And this bad history is now being taught in some classrooms in this country because people, in their haste to try to appear, like they want to appear open-minded. They want to appear as if, the Pulitzer Committee said it was good, so it must be. That's not the case. Any layman can go to this and look at it and compare it to evidence and see that they're wrong. They're ignoring, and it's important history too that they're ignoring. They're by saying that slavery began in North America in 1619, you ignore, first of all the slavery that was practiced before any Europeans stepped foot on this continent. Because the Native Americans, contrary to popular belief, practiced forms of bondage on each other, tribal bondage, which is tantamount to slavery. They didn't consider, if you weren't a member of the tribe, you could be considered on equal kilter with an animal or a spirit. You weren't even considered a full human in some cases. So what about that? How does that not bear mentioning? And then slavery was turned on the natives by the Europeans, but it wasn't the English that enslaved the first Native Americans or enslaved the first Africans on this continent. It was the Spanish and the Portuguese. What about that? They set up the imperial slave trade complex. How can that not be important to what the English did? The English couldn't have done it without that complex established. There wouldn't have been the Portuguese ships bringing in things to market for them to buy. There wouldn't have been the Spanish things they could emulate and see the benefit of it. In fact, the English might not have gotten involved, and other countries might not have gotten involved if Spain hadn't been so successful. So how can that not be part of the story?
Well, I'm just looking what the Pulitzer Prize that they got was I didn't know this. There are 14 American Pulitzer Prizes awarded annually for journalism, and the one this got was for commentary. Well, is that like no? I mean, is that like an editorial sorta? It's not. No. So that's what it won the award for, not for history.
Oh yeah, no, I understand. Yeah. But you would think that journalism has to be true.
I know, this is interesting. Here's the different awards. The different categories: public service, breaking news, investigative reporting, explanatory reporting, local reporting, national reporting, international, feature writing, criticism, editorial writing, editorial commentary. editorial cartooning, breaking news photography, so forth. So this is sort of like an editorial.
Oh yeah, yeah. It is in in its very bones an editorial, and it's a wrong editorial. It's an editorial. It's an editorial that's based on ideology rather than history. Because because one of the big problems too is that I'd still disagree with it if it just limited itself to its incorrect statements, but it doesn't. It also then tries to say that capitalism is that capitalism empowered slavery and was somehow part of this oppression, when the exact opposite is true. Capitalism helped break apart slavery because it didn't allow certain people to hold all of the power. It gave the individual more power. So the individual, for instance, with protests and things like that, where you could choose where your money went. Capitalism ensured that happened. It was the imperial system that set up the oppression of slavery. That's who made the money on slavery, not capitalism. So not only do they get the historical argument wrong, but then they throw in some bad economic ideas on top of it.
Well, I mean, an argument. Rome and Greece, they had slavery.
Yeah.
And the real reason that faded away is because feudalism displaced it. Feudalism, when it displaced slavery, it was more efficient, and that's why it displaced it. Slavery became less and less efficient over time in ancient times, and then it got displaced, and
basically, I was just going to say, basically, what it seems to have happened is religion just came up with a new idea, because it was the ancient kings of Sumer who used religion to instill slavery into the civilization, which then got passed down through all the civilizations. And then when slavery was no longer efficient in Rome and Greece because the slave populations were too big, they couldn't control them anymore. I think Rome at one point was like almost 30% slave population of the population. So when they transitioned to feudalism. When they realized they couldn't control them with slavery anymore, they went to feudalism. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but that thought just came to me while you were talking about feudalism. But yeah, no, you're right. It's inefficient, and I think that capitalism was more efficient. And I'm not saying capitalism of itself is somehow some benevolent system that wants to help everybody, but it isn't efficient to use slavery. It just isn't. Capitalism provides you a better way to make transactions and deals without having to enslave someone. And just the practice of slavery, what I think the South didn't understand is that they were never going to outcompete a capitalist North using slavery. You couldn't make new slaves fast enough. The amount of resources required to maintain the institution of slavery is why they lost.
Well, I've done looked at local history where I live, and the biggest slaveholder in the city that I live in, he had some plantations, and he also had cigar factories, which were people rolling cigars, and he had like hundreds of people doing this. I mean, he was a giant, operator, and he actually was against secession. He was one of the few people in the state of Virginia to vote against it, but then he supported it once the state succeeded. But when the war was over, he wrote letters to people saying that slavery was inefficient, and he's just making more money now that it's gone, because in his cigar factory he just pays wages and he doesn't have to feed these people or take care of them as much. And then on his old plantations he's got them sharecropping, so he's just making more money. And he's basically telling these people in these letters it's a waste of time to try to think about this slavery thing or celebrate it or make it come back. We can make more money now.
Yeah. And then that's the thing about capitalism, is that the reason why capitalism I would contend it's so successful is because it embraces the good and bad portions of us. it embraces our love of freedom and being able to make decisions and choices as we would choose with our own money. But at the same time, it also embraces our greed, which makes us want to get money to spend on things. And then it's a self-fulfilling system. You're then going to want to get more things and then spend more money, which will make you want to go and buy more things that you want to buy, and, on and on. And it doesn't require... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, to get back to your article and the arguments, on this topic, what is it when these people are talking about 1619 as the key date? What is it that they're trying to emphasize, or, what's their underlying theme or argument they're trying to get across to people or promote?
Well, I think that what it appears from what I've read anyway, I don't understand it as much as the creators understand their motivations, but I think that they're trying to basically put the oppression and thus the blame and who should have to, pay any restitution on the English and on the American colonists. And the problem with that is it ignores more than half of the time of slavery and how it occurred. You ignore the Portuguese, you ignore the French, you ignore the English, and you ignore the Native Americans. And I'm not talking about while there were tribes that practiced slavery on each other, there were also later Native American tribes that worked with Europeans to enslave their own people and take control of them or sell them off. So this is a system where everybody's hands got dirty, and the 1619 Project wants it to appear as if only white colonists and English people did this. That's not what happened. What happened is everyone, when they realized they could make an advantage off of other people, did so. And the white people did it later on. It was first the Portuguese, then the Spanish, then the English, French, and others. And we have to understand, too, something that's left out of the 1619 Project is religion's role in this. There's a very big role of religion in all of this. Slavery is endorsed by every major Abrahamic religion. So you can't just say, when the English came to the United States, they didn't come as white men. They came as Englishmen, and they came as Christians to convert people.
Well, I would hesitate in saying that I'm not as familiar with. I'm not going to speak for Islam or other religions, but I'd hesitate in saying Christianity, the Bible at least, promotes slavery. I would no doubt say that people have used the Bible to promote it, and the people in the South.
Oh yeah. I'm not saying that. Yeah, the interpretation can be various things, but to say that it hasn't been used, like you said, it has been used but it's been used by every major religion.
Okay.
You can find in the Torah, you can find in the Quran, you can find in the Bible that there are lines regarding slavery and even codes in subtexts where it discusses how you should treat a slave. And there was a big variance in how people treated them, but ultimately they still were slaves. All slavery is wrong. It doesn't matter how nice they treated their slaves. And you see people trying to make historical excuses.
Well, one thing I would say about it, though, too, is that I think it's changed over the centuries a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'm more familiar, I don't know what happened that much. There's not that much detail in the Bible about slavery.
Yeah.
It's just kind of mentioned. But I know in Rome, most of the slaves, or all of them, for really, were people that were captured in battle or plunder of cities. They took the women out of a city and now they're slaves. Or they defeated an army on the battlefield and they gave the vanquished the option of becoming a slave or being killed.
Yes. No,
so,
I was just going to say, yeah, that is the majority of them. There were also instances, which I think a lot of people don't know about, and there were poor people that sold themselves into slavery because they had no other choice. That there were actually people that enslaved themselves because their life was so bad that they could have a better life operating as a servant in the palace than being on the streets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I also think in these ancient times, it was possible for some of the slaves to eventually not be slaves.
Yeah, in certain societies, it
Yeah.
depended. It depended. It was actually, I think you're right that in some ancient areas, like Rome and Greece, for instance, it was there was the opportunity for a lot of people to be able to ascend, even to the point to where there were some slaves that were in the Roman government. So
Mm-hmm.
so you
Yeah, there
could,
was.
yeah, you could definitely ascend in some of those areas where you couldn't later on. But for the most part, besides Rome and Greece, like in the cities proper, if you were in the countryside, that wasn't always the case. Sometimes, there were actually slaves too that weren't just held by a person, they were held by villages. So the village pooled their money and bought a village slave. So you didn't just have to do the work for one person, you had to do the whole village's work when they called upon you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just think it's a much bigger calculation than people understand, and I'm not minimizing it, but we have to be realistic in what the impact is of certain periods, and of course the periods that are most personal to us are going to seem the most important, but that doesn't mean they necessarily are. And I understand that that's not going to make some people very happy, but that's the truth. The truth is it's a much bigger picture than just one section of one part of slavery in one continent. And, if we really want to see the whole picture, we have to look at that. We have to look at where it really started in North America and how it was allowed to grow into what it became and how it ended. and I think that that's part of it too, that people, it may take as long or longer than it existed for it to ever fully go away, but it's not gone. Slavery still exists in the modern world. And if we don't understand the whole of the past, then I don't know if we can ever stop it.
Well, I'm just looking up. I don't know what this is, but there's another project that's come out to counter this one called the 1776 Project.
And I fully endorse it. I've read about the founder. He's a good guy. It's basically a group of black historians who are coming out to correct what the 1619 Project claims. And I remember in one of the interviews I was watching, the gentleman that's in charge of the 1776 Project said that black people are not a bauble to be led around on a historical string, and I agree with that. No group of people is without their own agency. To forever say that you cannot, get beyond what has happened to you in the past is not true. And ultimately, I don't think it's helpful. I don't think anybody is going to get anything out of thinking that. I mean, you can just see it's not true. There are plenty. What's crazy is when you look at it, for all the problems we might have today, in the period after slavery in the United States, up until I'd say about the 40s or 50s, the statistics of black Americans were on par, and in some cases better than white Americans. So people can do amazing things in short amount of time. It's not that we can't do these things. It's not that we can't make it so all Americans can enjoy more equality and freedom under the law. It's that we have to assess the problem correctly, honestly, openly, without feeling, and really try to get at the root of it so we can understand it.
Well, I'm just looking at the Wikipedia stuff. These 1776 people, they're claiming one of their arguments or problems they had with the other study is they believe the other study makes it sound as if black America has been so oppressed that they have no agency at all.
Yeah.
And they're trying to they want to debunk that and make people realize that black people achieved, they had businesses and all sorts of leaders and figures culturally and politically and so forth, throughout American history, and they're
Yeah.
claiming that the other project just kind of ignores all them.
Well, yeah, I think one of the problems with, that I would have, I mean, add it to the list, but I agree. One of the problems with the 1619 project, and it's not just the 1619 project. I think it's a modern problem. If you look in a lot of areas of grievance study, people are assuming themselves as the role of victim and never looking to ever get beyond that. It's as if only they want to indelibly mark themselves as a victim of history, rather than learn from the history, empower yourself, make sure nobody else is a victim, and then move forward. But that forward motion is not occurring. And one of the reasons it's not occurring is because bad information is being given out. People are being painted in a light that isn't true. And instead of, as where we can, I don't want to get too much into all this, but what you see happening with the statues, people are opting in some cases to destroy history and remake it in their own claims rather than to learn from it and see why it occurred and how we can prevent it from ever occurring again.
Well, I would suggest people are better off to read your article.
Well, thank you.
And start there, then read other things about this, than to even look at these statues, get mad at them, or look at them as some source of anything. 'Cause I don't think they teach much at all. They're just like these things.
Yeah, they're just symbols.
Yeah.
And I hope people found what we had to discuss interesting, and I hope there's more conversations that happen, because that's ultimately, I think, is what's going to change things.
For sure.
Building statues and tearing them down isn't going to change things.
For sure. Well, I'll link to this and suggest everyone click the link and read the whole article, because there's much more in there than what we talked about. We're just getting the theme of some of this stuff, and that's, they need to read this in detail, and you also have plenty of links. People can jump off and get even, they see everything that you're using for your sources and and so forth.
Unlike some major media sources, we actually link to our evidence.
That's right. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me and everyone else, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, I look forward to it. Take care, Mike.